going to go to a space where you don't have to worry about work, where you get to rest a bit and enjoy the sunshine, unless there's too much sunshine, versus kind of what happens in a crime story when something bad happens to a seaside community, where it's a kind of horrifying break from reality. And I think an interesting thing is that both uses, so our average expectation of what a kind of seaside break would be versus a crime story, are both breaks from reality in different ways, which is why I think they work well and go here, because a crime and a holiday are weirdly similar and have these kind of comparisons involved. Not only do we experience this in reading as well, so there's a break from reality when you go on holiday, a break from reality when you have a crime, and a break from reality when you read a fictional book. So you've now got 3 breaks from reality that are similar in different ways, but conceptually different. But also the detectives themselves in these stories are often also on holiday. So you've now got a kind of a quadrupling of kind of breaks from reality, which is really weird. And it's so weird that's such a common trope that the detective is on holiday and happens to have a crime happen wherever they're staying. It's like a very strange but bizarre detail I really think adds to the atmosphere of a lot of crime stories. So I'm going to start with an example of Broadchurch. So Broadchurch starts with a kind of child's death and has a broken community. It's got a lot of the kind of tropes we'd expect of the genre, like a kidnapped or murdered kid. And I think interestingly, in terms of specifically British storytelling, this kind of looms large, because I think in the kind of national imagination, due to kind of a lot of real crimes, the idea of missing young child is like a big kind of like archetypal kind of myth that we have. And it's this both like real and imagined. I think the Seaside is also interesting in how it links to children and cases involving children, because it's where we often take children. So children on trips will be taken to the seaside. A lot of things that are sold for a holiday on the seaside involve children. So building sandcastles, little buckets and things like that are all for children. And interestingly, and once again in another weird doubling, they're a place we will often remember fondly from when we were children, in that the children tend to interact in a different way with the beach than adults. Apart from those people who build those amazing sandcastles that are like really complex, which obviously children want to just rubbish compared to that. But I think Broadchurch interests me because it's fascinatingly cozy at the same time, despite how contemporary it is and the kind of darkness of some of the stuff it deals with. And there's a kind of weird presence. This is a kind of slight side observation, but there's a weird presence of kind of journalists and journalism in a lot of these stories have a kind of weird link to. Such as Brighton Rock, which I'll be going on to talk about, which starts with the kind of murder of someone who works for a newspaper. But a thing that kind of struck me as fascinating about Broadchurch was the presence of a fully functioning newspaper in this small town. So we're told that this is a small seaside town. It's not doing too badly. There's sort of intimations that there's some kind of problem with the community, but it seems reasonably well attended and has reasonable condition buildings and so on as a UK seaside town. But they have a local newspaper that has its own building of substantial size with multiple people working there, which for any local community would be a rarity, let alone the kind of community we're talking about. So it's this interesting vision of what the UK is that's preserved, which I think is often associated with the kind of cozy narratives that you have there, despite the other tropes being almost kind of Twin Peaksy kind of death leading to dissolution of small community and like seedy kind of sexual details and stuff. Interesting in how they rub up against each other. Also, interestingly, in the genre of these kind of broken seaside town stories, there's often a kind of problem with the local police force, or indeed in these kind of narratives of far off. Interestingly, I think the last talk ties into this a bit as well in terms of broken kind of frontier places. You often have a kind of a police force that's not quite working, and either the main detective or investigator is on holiday, or a member of the public has to step in to do the police's job when they're not doing it, or you often have a kind of exiled police officer or detective that was from another force who's now had to come here because of something that's gone wrong and they redeem themselves in the local community. And you get that a bit present in Broadchurch as well, though I do think the police force is also quite functional in this novel, in this show as compared to other things in the genre. Now to talk about something that's quite different, but I think rubs up against that in interesting ways, is Brighton Rock. So Brighton Rock, the novel by Greene, has a kind of a vision of Brighton that's kind of also has a kind of odd mixture of kind of pleasantry and darkness, but I think even more striated into different directions. You get a very kind of cheery seaside in some respects, lingering in the background, and almost apocalyptic kind of level of darkness in terms of the crime narrative. And almost these kind of two strands of what Brighton is are represented in the characters Ida and Pinky. So both of them are obsessed with ideas of right and wrong and good and evil, but Ida comes more from the universe of the kind of cheery, bright side view of things. And Pinky's existing in this very kind of Catholic, apocalyptic, Old Testament world of good and evil. And I think the way the seaside town is used in this story is the kind of the battle for souls that occurs, that's often directly referred to, happens on the edges of the UK. There's a lot of references to going to and from Brighton and kind of Brighton being far away. The town has. People are literally killed against barriers and edges in the story. So Kite's death before the narrative begins again at a train station. The behaviour of some of these characters isn't really questioned. The police are anarchically leaving gangs to kill each other. They mostly care about what they say as like good people or important people. They don't care about what's happening amongst themselves. And I think one of the most important lines to me in the story, despite the fact that Pinky is often seen as being this kind of completely monstrous, kind of Cormac McCarthy-ish kind of human being who, like Anton Chigurh before his time, is there's a line where he's talking to the lawyer and he says something like the lawyer, because he's trying to get married to avoid kind of punishment for his crime, he says something to the effect of, he's asked about his parents and he says he don't have any, and he's asked about guardian, and not only does he not refuse to say he has a guardian, he doesn't understand the concept of what's being referred to, despite the fact he's like 17, like who raised you, like he just doesn't understand. And I think there's almost a kind of secondary story hidden on the edges of Brighton Rock regarding why this all happened in the first place, and that Pinky's kind of murder of the journalist at the very beginning of the story, although it sets absolutely everything into motion and the story is all committed to following on from that, it wasn't necessary economically for his gang to function. It wasn't for profit. It wasn't for kind of malice, in terms of malice in a sense of they would get something as a gang by doing it. There's no objective achieved. It's for revenge because Kite was killed, and Kite seems to be the closest thing he had to a mentor, and he talks about liking Kite and stuff like that. Of the crimes committed in the story, you could imagine another universe version of this story, especially if we set it a few hundred years earlier, where this kind of revenge plot is depicted in a kind of very different way of trying to get justice for his kind of companion. Now, this is not to say the rest of his actions aren't bad and lead to a lot of kind of evil consequences, but I think it's interesting that there's this kind of very vague, almost like society having let Pinky down thread that's present in this story, and also this kind of alternative narrative that could emerge from it if plucked at. And I just find that really interesting, especially given what I'm going to go on to talk about regarding the role of these kind of seaside towns and isolated places. Now, I'm going to compare this also to something very old as a story. So we would normally call it a crime story, but there are a lot of crimes committed in Greek myth. So I'm going to talk about Bacchae of Euripides. So the play, The Bacchae, is about Dionysus, god of madness, theatre, kind of fictional stuff, alcohol and wine and so on, arrives to basically spread his cult amongst the people of Thebes, I think it's Thebes, but he, in disguise, is confronted by the young male fascistic leader of this place, Pentheus, who, much like Pinky from Brighton Rock, is perfectly willing to kill people, but is puritanically, varyingly repelled and obsessed with sex and women and these kind of other details of kind of life, which often, if you were to create a criminal character, often these criminal characters are engaged in all sorts of vices, but the idea of vice as killing as being a very different thing to sex, as like the real thing to be feared, is present in both stories amongst these kind of young male characters. Likewise, in both stories, these kind of stories on the margins of the world and civilization, these characters are confronted by women and a kind of a figure who embodies revelry and all the things he rejects. So kind of Ida, who's really strongly associated with sex and alcohol, and Dionysus himself. And interestingly also, if we think about what these two characters are rejecting in these kind of liminal spaces, they're rejecting things that we also, once again, would quite associate with holidays and breaks. So the idea of fictional enjoyment, drink, being outside of the normal reality is literally being rubbed up against in these narratives. And so to think and reiterate some of what I've been saying so far, so liminal spaces, by liminal, like on the edge, borderline boundaries of what you'd expect. If we have the idea of holidays and breaks, as I said, the idea of a holiday is similar to what happens when we read a novel. We're in a magic space that's a break from normal reality. Detectives are often on holiday in these stories, which is interesting, is also we're often reading books on holidays. So you're sitting there reading a book about a detective who's on a holiday, often in the same kind of location you're in, and that's a bit fun. So W.H. Smith's travel, having nice lots of tie-ins to why you were there. But also to build on what you see when you sit on the beach and what you'll see in the background during all these stories is the sea itself or the ocean. Now, the use of the word, some of these words have changed meaning a lot over time, but tragedy originally didn't just refer to the idea of something bad happening. It was a very specific in its meaning. It meant a kind of, there's lots of different things it's been argued to mean, but it's a kind of a form of kind of theatre or fiction where you have a kind of downfall and descent that happens due to very specific reasons. So the idea if we say like a bus crash was a tragedy, that wouldn't be a tragedy in the old sense, because a tragedy in the old sense is supposed to have a kind of inexorable kind of pull of fate and cause and effect, not a random occurrence. Likewise, the word the sublime, we would often say, oh, I had the sublime bath earlier, oh, that chocolate bar was sublime or something. But the old sense of the word sublime was almost something that was too awesome to fully comprehend in your mind and holds an idea in your mind. And the sea was often a kind of image of this. And this is now transplanted a bit to be like space, because we understand the ocean and the sea. Maybe not how deep it is, but like we get it. It's not like it used to be where it was. But it's too big to think about. And this kind of being in the constant background of all these stories, I think a lot of writers use it, because I'm interested in this kind of talk, not just in terms of what these things might symbolically mean, but like why are they useful to writers? And almost everyone is intuitively aware of the idea that weather in the background of a story often echoes the emotional states of characters, which is what we would call in English literature the pathetic fallacy. So weather mirroring mood, but likewise setting up mood. So you can often, it's a tool that writers will use to help you get in the mindset of what's happening for the scene and the character. But I think the sea itself can act almost like weather with its presence and what's happening with the sea. And there's a kind of question, so I've recently got married, my new wife, or only wife I've ever had, that's the secret ones I'm not talking about, is she asks sorts of strange questions. Oh, if you're a dinosaur, what dinosaur would you be? But kind of a big recent one is, would you rather it be always too hot or always too cold? And although I often like summer, as many of us do, I'd actually rather it be cold than hot. There's something oppressive about the heat and something you think you're supposed to like. But when it's here, as we can witness in this current weather, and as I'm definitely feeling coming from Scotland to down south, it can be a lot. The heat, and you can escape from the cold a lot more easily than you can escape from the heat sometimes, especially with the construction of the UK. And so I think there's something really interesting about this kind of setting that's supposed to be good, and you're supposed to like, and you're supposed to enjoy yourself in, that can crush you down. Likewise, in terms of this idea of a magical circle of play, which is a kind of term sometimes used in theory to refer to what happens when when a child's playing a game, which is obviously like a mock version of what a writer does when they write a book, come up with a story, embodying it, playing it out. There's something, I always can't really pronounce his name, but Zizek, I think is the way you pronounce it. The philosopher was talking a little while back about video games, and in video games how they're an interesting example of ethics, and people can show you who they are, because in a video game, the actions you take aren't real, so to speak. They have no consequences necessarily outside of the space of the game. But and so this kind of magical circle where you can act out, much like in a child playing cops and robbers or something, things you don't actually have effects outside of that space. But he claims it often matters more if you're truly inhabiting the fictional kind of conceit of what you're doing in the game. What you choose to do there might say more about you than a lot of real life actions, because you're acting what you would do with no consequence without kind of societal restrictions. That's debatable in some ways, because there's clearly what I would call a bit of kind of aesthetic posturing, I think we do when we play those kind of things, where, for example, if I'm acting out a kind of, or let's say in a workplace, if you're doing some kind of role play scenario where you're showing what would happen in the situation if a manager of a shop got, but you're clearly doing a bit of aesthetic posturing. You're taking on a role and you're choosing to do it a certain way for storytelling purposes, not for ethical purposes, which I think is different. But I think in terms of, if we apply all these concepts to this weird overlap of holiday, crime, sex on a holiday, you on holiday by reading a book. There's a lot of kind of interesting examples of breaks from reality, magic circles of play going on in many different ways there that I think are quite interesting in terms of the way you respond to that story. If we say that the way you respond to stories says something about you as a human being. And so I think there's a lot about novels set in this place that give writers a lot of room to explore issues of good, evil, and fiction itself. Now, in terms of some of the kind of influences I had on my own first novel, which is set by the sea, it combines town and country in some ways, and seaside, in that it starts in a kind of farm near the sea, but it's very much wide rolling fields, you can't see the sea. And then the sea itself closer, and these kind of almost little different types of land, and there's woods, so you get different types of location, thin alleys within, there's a kind of microcosm in one place. It was partly the image of the town itself as a kind of patchwork of various places I visited and spent time in. Kind of part of the initial concept was based on Great Yarmouth, which was quite nearby where I was studying at the time in kind of Norwich at UEA. And the first time I went there, it was a really off-season day. So the streets were completely empty, but all the arcade lights were on, which is a kind of key image from early 16 Horses. And it was just so creepy and kind of abandoned, but on and waiting, that kind of made it feel there's almost haunted atmosphere to it. Likewise, my parents live on the kind of Thanet coast, near kind of Broadstairs, which obviously shows a bit of Broadchurch, and as well as Summers working on a farm on the northern Scottish coast, which has quite a lot of small, very kind of isolated seaside towns with kind of lots of local drama going on, but a lot of places in Scotland have a lot of local drama, as we were discussing before the talk. So it's a patchwork of all those kind of influences, but I also drew from some kind of literary influences in terms of other kind of holiday works. So a big important one that was mentioned in the talk description is Picnic at Hanging Rock, which is this fantastic novel and film, the Peter Weir film. I haven't actually seen the more recent adaptation, but it's about some schoolgirls going to this place in Australia, and this almost Midsummer Night's Dream aspect to them falling asleep at lunch, and some girls go up the hill and they never come back. One of them's found, this is all fairly old on in the film and is the premise, and the work is far more about what it does to the people left behind and the dissolution of the community and the way they respond than it is about the disappearance. Although that's key and horrific, you don't really get it solved. Interestingly, if you look online, you will discover, and I think it's one of my favorite kind of stories about an author and the publishing process, is she actually did provide an explanation in the original draft of what happened to the girls, but the editor suggested she cut it because it was more effective without it. It is the weirdest thing ever. I won't quite spoil what it is, but like it's like a completely different genre. It's a completely different type of story, and it's definitely better for it being cut, but it's really interesting to hear what happened to the girls, because that was considered a kind of famous mystery. I think it was one of those awful things where it was published after her death, in like a special edition, where it probably shouldn't have been published. Like that was probably a good call to cut that description. Likewise, Don't Look Now, the idea of twisting alleys, of one thing I really liked about it is this kind of way it's holiday / workspace kind of sit uncomfortably with each other. So the kind of, he's there, the dad is working in Venice, but it's also a place where people are visiting as tourists, and he's in a hotel there as a tourist, but also working at the same time, so it rubs up against a lot of the detective on holiday tropes. And yeah, and I think Picnic at Hanging Rock is also quite interesting to me in the way that once you get the kids going missing, the schools sort of become, there's a lot of issues not just about community, but about authority at that point, like the authority trying to take charge, which kind of really reminds me of the earlier stuff from like Brighton Rock and so on, where you get a lot of things, and Backeye, where you get a lot of stuff about authority and how this responds to these kind of fragmented situations. I also think, to go back to the idea of childhood, if Seaside represents play, fiction, childhood in many different ways, then a lot of crime novels are almost like that are set there, are almost like a kind of return to Oz, return to a kind of childhood landscape, but where the thing you remember wasn't really like as you remember in the first place, like you probably misremembered, but it's also now warped and is under threat now that the same adult has returned. Kind of also another way of viewing it, if you're not familiar with Return to Oz, is even within The Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe, first visit to Narnia far more pleasant than return visit to Narnia, where things are significantly worse. And As mentioned, I think that the sea itself works as a kind of interesting kind of pathetic fallacy, the weather reflecting the storyline. But I also think the kind of crumbling nature of the world in these seaside stories often can be used by authors to comment upon, not just comment upon, but use current day situations for storytelling effect. And this is certainly what I tried to do in my own work. As referenced in the last talk, the impact of global warming and ruined environment upon these settings. I think, and the way in which I want to say this as well is works can have a kind of political intent, but the political can also be used to back up your emotional strands. Using global warming almost in the same way as you would use clouds to refer to a sad character's emotions. The global warming itself can be used as an ultra kind of form of pathetic fallacy where the ruined world quite literally echoes the ruined character. Forgotten communities and what's happening to seaside spaces. Cozy narratives have a lot of appeal in different ways, but I think it's interesting what coziness does and coziness relationship to pastoral kind of old ideas of kind of England and Scotland and Wales and North Ireland. There's kind of an old countryside vision, and to the extent to which the old countryside is even now intact or ever was the way it was is quite interesting in terms of what kind of fantasy you're trying to provide in terms of the fantasy of the fiction. And I think a lot of this applies not just to seaside spaces, but any far-off liminal space as well. I think The Dry, for example, is very interesting as like another Australian novel where you have a detective who quite literally returns to his youth, in that the memories of his youth and where he lived as a young person are there, but the police force requiring an outsider. The idea of an outsider is very archetypal in fiction, even going back to Beowulf arriving, the outsider to the land, restore the thing that's wrong and get it back to normal. And I think these often lead to certain tropes which accurately reflect the real world and to make a political point, but they're there as much for that's a convenient purpose for the writer. So if the detective is an exile who's come back, or a police force needs an outsider's help, which will often happen in these stories, if a police force needs an outsider, then something's wrong with the police department, which means you're more likely to have problems with the police department, which might therefore echo real world problems. So the kind of the form of what the story requires for the story to exist itself often means that social problems are useful for the writer. And I think in the British novel, instead of the outback, we often would have kind of forests and countryside. And just for a moment to contrast the seaside to inland space, which I think is quite interesting comparison. The seat of kind of cozy crime and its tonal presence is often depicted as far more natural, understandable. There's a lot of systems, a lot of people know each other. One of my favorite sort of kind of narratives of this kind actually is a parodic narrative, which I'm sure many of us have seen, called Hot Fuzz. And I actually got quite upset when I saw Hot Fuzz because I saw it reasonably late on, and there were some tropes that were going to be in 16 Horses which were just like in Hot Fuzz. There was going to be like a bad local shopkeeper or something. And if any of you remember the slasher of prices from the film, every time I heard that I was like, oh no. So I had to cut that kind of content from my own story, and I lent to more of an anonymous owner of some of these places and tried to make it more spooky in that regard. But I think the countryside, it's interesting how coziness of that countryside environment can be contrasted to other uses, perhaps older uses of such spaces, where it's Gothic, to be honest, where these kind of isolated places, these fields, instead of seeing as a kind of warm, welcoming place, can be seen as uncanny, haunted places which are far from help and which are more associated with the old, which can be more like a kind of ghostly atmosphere. And I think if the sea can be seen not just as a kind of pleasant, sunny place for a story setting, but can be inverted to be sublime and lost childhood. Countryside can be seen as haunted in a different way. Quite literally lost, hidden in the middle, erased. Often people reading about these settings may perhaps live in a city, and that many people live in a city, which kind of is the countryside is like a very lost ideal. It was interesting, I had a kind of stag weekend a couple of months ago where I invited friends from across the place to my local area, which for them was like stepping on Mars in terms of going to a small community where people knew each other and everything was very far away and there was no kind of Deliveroo and things like that. Everyone was getting very upset. And some controversial things were said by some of those people about where I live, which I will not share. And I think also as well, often these country places in these stories are often, in a way which is sometimes accurate to some of these regions, sometimes not, depends on where you're talking about, but are often depicted as a bit more rich rather than poor, which is often associated with the seaside. And in my new novel, which kind of few details have been released about, called Consumed, I'm purposefully, it was interesting that this kind of talk exists and stuff, because this is very much what I'm trying to explore on purpose in a kind of inversion, a lot of the kind of seaside tropes which I explored in the other narratives. Consumed begins with a kind of retired war photographer being found dead, having seemingly fallen near her pigs that she keeps on her property, and the pigs seem to have eaten her, which is a thing that indeed happens, as I'm sure we've all read about in paper at one point or another about a pig has eaten someone. Happens. But whether this is indeed something that happened or is indeed has more to it is indeed the point of the novel. Whether that is just a kind of coincidence, in that it quite possibly, as investigators soon discover, may be linked to two disappearances that happened almost 60 years before the narrative began. And in developing this novel, which shares one of its lead characters with 16 Horses, so 16 Horses has a kind of veterinarian called Cooper in it, and this is set a few years on and has a connective thread in that she is also present in this novel. I approached it to be purposefully inverting a number of the tropes of 16 Horses. Various people were saying, oh, you're going to do a sequel to 16 Horses, you're going to do a sequel to 16 Horses. I referred to it as like the 15 geese problem, in that I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to have another arbitrary number of animals die and then some kind of investigation. I was very derogatory about the idea of doing something that followed on. But I did a bit of a thought exercise, which is how I initially developed some of this ideas, by purposefully inverting some of my ideas for 16 Horses and doing the opposite and seeing if I could find a space that would exist there. So instead of a poor community, a rich community. Instead of a community that's isolated alone, have it that's excessively full of people. Instead of having it begin with an animal being hurt by humans, have it begin with a human that seems to have been hurt by animals. Instead of a cold, snowy environment, have a rich, warm environment. And interestingly, 16 Horses itself had a kind of exiled detective as part of its role. So you have an outsider coming in terms of forensics expert, but you also have a kind of policeman who used to work elsewhere trope going on there. In this one, I'm very much playing around with the holidaying detective trope a bit. So one of the characters is on holiday in this place and gets dragged into it. But there's a bit of a kind of reflection on that as a trope and genre in terms of how I'm exploring it, because I just find it the kind of weirdest thing that I think someone said about sci-fi stories that a lot of the best sci-fi, if it has one thing different about that world to our world, is often how it justifies itself, in that you accept the thing that's different, but if you have too many things that are different from our world, you can't quite get over it. And even indeed in crime fiction, the idea that one person would often solve some of this stuff as opposed to a team of people, or the tidy conclusions, is often something we accept because we like the genre and not because we think that's how it actually happens in real life. But I think the holidaying detective thing is something we really accept as a thing in all these narratives that I think can be pulled apart a bit and explored. And so I'm finding it very fertile, strange to look in with it, because it's an idea of also, if you see the detective as often arriving to fix the community and kind of cure the poison of the community by arriving and getting rid of the disordered, weird criminal stuff and making it safe again. Often, by being on holiday, the detective seems to bring the problem with them. It's like they've spread poison to the community through their presence, often with the reason they're on holiday, and someone is often quite interested in the reason they've been exiled. So I think that's quite cool. So yeah, that is my talk, a bunch of kind of miscellaneous thoughts about the seaside and stuff. Yeah.